15 days ago, the team at Visionary Realms held the May VIP Developer Roundtable, dividing the questions from the backers regarding the combat and adventuring aspects of Pantheon. This segment covers various topics including combat improvements and class balancing they've been doing, variation of resurrection spells between the classes alongside how one would go about repairing gear, balancing slope of difficulty, durability hits on death, etc. This entire episode was over an hour long and completely packed with details, so the best thing for us to do is to jump right into it. We start off hearing about updates to the perception system in Pantheon. For those unaware, perception is a unique system in this game that allows players to identify hidden details and clues around them. These could pertain to obtaining or progressing questlines, discovering more about the lore. The system even goes so far as to differentiate between what one class may perceive versus another. A wizard might come across something that a warrior cannot, but to be fair, that makes sense because normally warriors are kind of dumb. I should know since I play one too. Through prayer, a cleric might gain insight into an area or creature that a rogue can never know. In this video, they mention that currently they still know the design they're bringing forward with the perception system, but it's still waiting its turn in the queue for programming resources that can implement all the nuts and bolts and front-end UI, along with everything they need so that the designers have the tools to bring the system to life. Part of the reason they haven't spoke about it as much is that it's still possible for them to run into roadblocks when they reach the actual implementation phase. This is a system that needs to be felt out in implementation and one that they really want to take their time with. They then continue by talking about what the intent would be for resurrection between the priest classes, along with answering if each one of them will have their own resurrection spell, do they give the same return of experience, and will they be earned at the same level for each class. Their response to this is that it's important for resurrection to have some parity between the classes capable of performing it. The rest of this response was a bit difficult to interpret, but it seems as if they're stating that each class is going to receive a resurrection spell around the exact same level. They don't want to favor one class over another in this particular area, because that could be detrimental to the group viabilities for many healers. If they did, you might decide to take a shaman or a cleric instead of a druid in a dangerous situation depending on the viability of each one. Which in my opinion, when it comes to the classes as a whole, should be the general idea. When we look at different healers in MMORPGs, I feel like it would make sense for one healer to be better in one area than another. Like if the cleric specializes in single target healing and shamans are great for AoE or raid based healing. That sounds like a much better way to go for me than all healers being very similar to each other and basically feeling like the same car with different coats of paint. But they do say towards the end that this doesn't mean that there won't be different forms of resurrection, so that does give some more clarity on what their overall plan is for this system. We next get some details on the topic, durability hits that happen on death. The specific question asked by the VIP backer was, given that you announced that durability loss will happen on death, will that durability loss apply to both the random number of your worn items and have a random durability loss amount, or will it be a predictable amount of durability loss on all worn items? So basically the question is asking, will all my equipment pieces lose 25% durability every time on death, or is it random? Their answer is that the durability loss will apply to everything that is worn on the character and vulnerable to durability loss, meaning that there will be certain items or enchantments that can ignore or prevent durability loss, but for everything you're wearing that is vulnerable to the loss, your items will take a hit on death. However, the actual amount reduced is going to be determined per item and it will have some variety to it. They don't want to provide an overly predictable durability loss because they don't want players to be able to definitively say when exactly their gear is going to break or not. They expand on this in the next section by confirming that the items will not reduce in effectiveness as their durability goes down. For example, a breastplate that has 15 AC at 100 durability will not lose it as the durability goes down. They then ask, what challenges does the design team run into while attempting to keep the slope of difficulty relatively even between adventuring, environments, and combat encounters as players advance through Terminus? They weren't 100% on how to answer this, so they decided to tackle a specific aspect of it. Generally speaking, they're not really looking to create an even slope. They don't want to have that sense that players should always expect the same difficulty curve regardless of content they're undertaking. Like, they don't want you to go to a level 10 area and have it be guaranteed to be tuned so precisely to feel like every other level 10 area in the game. They want the world to have texture and variety, and for there to be multiple cost-benefit decisions that the player can weigh. What they look to offset this is in the reward structure. The more difficult an area is to overcome, the more rewarding it should be when you overcome it. The next section dives into combat. Combat in previous alphas was fun, but the fluidness of combat wasn't quite there. I know this system is a work in progress, but they wanted to know what kind of headway the team has made with the feel of combat and group play. The answer is that they announced their adjustments to combat around last fall or last summer, somewhere in there, and they haven't really talked about it to a huge degree. But he does state that if you look at the Co-Carnage stream from last year, that's kind of a neat way to be able to look back at the most recent public iteration of combat. So with everything he's about to talk about, you can follow along with that stream to know exactly what he's pointing out or highlighting. They mention that there's a few things going on in that stream that can use improvements. The first is the relationship between resource gains and the availability of actions. In specific, on the rogue that Co is playing, you can see how endurance, which is the yellow bar in the upper left corner, is fluctuating very frequently. There's a lot of action spam being generated and not a whole lot of clarity on why you're consuming it or how much. Their goal is to work on better controlling the rate at which those core combat resources are being accrued. And in doing that, drive more tactical moment-to-moment decision-making instead of always using an ability just because it's available or because the rotation dictates it. They confirm in this section that they aim to reduce the amount of actions per minute, and they want to be really clear that what they're building is a game that is intending to be mentally stimulating and challenging, not just a measure of finger dexterity or responsiveness. There's still going to be situations where that can matter, but the emphasis is really on tactical team play. The next section dives into the question, will geography affect aspects of the game like druid abilities? Like if you're in the forest and call an animal, will it be a certain color or will it be a certain type of animal compared to a different area in the game? Perhaps on the spell side, a druid's lightning might get affected in a dungeon as opposed to outside. A fighter's broad stroke might change in tight areas within trees outside or tight passages within dungeon areas. Can the players expect something like this? The answer is, they wish they could say more about this aspect, but they do plan to have these features. They want to have different effects tied to dynamic weather at the very least, alongside whether you're indoors or outdoors, but they're still exploring the extent of how far this will be taken, and the specific types of variants we'll see. This next section deals with perception, which actually has a few questions presented during this developer roundtable, but we won't be diving into every single one of them in this video. The next question reads, will perception, law knowledge, and acclimation affect class abilities? For example, would they be more likely to hit, crit, and or will the strength of the hit increase penetration based off this? In response, they say, to call back to previous details mentioned regarding perception, they're completely okay with perception being used as an amplifier, something that allows groups to access additional aspects of the game or make more informed decisions, but directly influencing something like a stat or potency would really move the needle from being an opt-in system to being viewed as an extremely important aspect for gameplay, which is something they'd like to avoid. Number 9 deals with the aspect of corpse runs. If you die at sea, will you have to sail to the area to retrieve your corpse, swim to the bottom, track and find your body at the nearest shoreline, or will another class be able to potentially summon your corpse? There's definitely going to be some form of corpse summoning. They can't commit to what classes may or may not have access to it, but it will exist in some way, shape, or form. In terms of how corpses are going to be collected from the ocean, as interesting as it is to think about tracking a corpse through currents, they're stating that they aren't planning to finalize something like how this is going to work until it receives more testing. Next question, what are the guiding principles to ensure that even with a limited action set, you're able to provide a unique combat experience for each class in the game? Now before we dive into this, for those unaware, Pantheon plans to use what is known as a limited action set for its ability system. This is an artificial restriction for how many skills are available to the player at one time, which is seen in MMOs like Guild Wars 2 and Neverwinter. So instead of seeing 3 or 4 bars full of skills, or bloat as some gamers would call it, in Pantheon they aim to shorten that down to what I can only assume would be about 1 or 2 bars max. The first thing they wanted to say about this is that they do feel it provides a more unique class experience than you would have without it. Most games allow players to access a full suite of abilities, and games that do typically devolve into class systems where even though each class has differences in terms of resource management or theme, it normally boils down to hitting the same rotation of abilities in a predetermined optimal order, and the end result is that even between distinct classes, the actual feel of gameplay doesn't feel all that different. But the limited action set is about taking those button presses and making each one of them feel meaningful in its own right. However, there's always going to be some degree of overlap between things like basic damage spells or techniques, but their goal is to make each class as unique as they can to ensure the best possible experience. This is followed up by another perception question, but I want to go ahead and skip this one because there have been so many perception-based questions in this developer roundtable that we might as well wait to put it all in one completely separate video. But it's also still a feature in progress, so I feel we can afford to wait on going into too much detail for it. The next question reads, will I have to travel to town to repair my armor/melee weapon, build a forge somewhere, or would it be possible to carry a repair kit? Their answer is they do want to provide avenues for crafters so they can do repair services. They don't want players to expect to return to town every single time they need to make a repair, but they also don't want field repairs to be as simple as making sure you have a crafter in the party either. They want it to be a bit more involved than that so players can anticipate planning for possibly detouring their adventure, getting more materials, etc. Number 12 is, will the classes be balanced around specific weapon types so that one weapon is generally better than the others, or will they try to evenly balance them? For example, a bow versus a crossbow, or dagger versus a mace. They respond with, for melee classes, they're generally going to have one, possibly two weapon skills that are considered better for the class overall. So just like rogues with daggers, monks with fist weapons, combinations like that. But that shouldn't be misconstrued as pigeonholing them into these choices. When it comes to other weapons and players that are looking to use them, even if these choices are considered to be quote-unquote suboptimal because their skill cap is lower, there is absolutely still a viable path to making them just as effective as everything else. It just requires a bit more work or requires a different approach than if you were just following your standard build composition. Moving on to the next VIP question, in a lot of games, there are always ways to solo farm bosses or areas that aren't meant for soloing. This abusive behavior can have a negative impact on the economy when someone can farm 2 times, 3 times, 4 times as much as other classes. Are there any plans to stop this, such as making the boss teleport to the attacker if no player or pet is in hitting range? To answer this, they state that we probably won't be seeing a mechanic like this when it comes to bosses. Having them teleport to you or get summoned in this context might be a bit cheesy. That's not to say they aren't going to have these type of mechanics when it's appropriate, but they feel for a game where it's important to embrace class identity and player skill in the way Pantheon does, they really need to support and allow some of this inequity. They would rather ensure we have a greater variety in encounters, and they don't need a boss to teleport to a ranged character for it to be dangerous. They can make it so it's generally something that is ranged but is more disruptible if you get close, or, and this is just my opinion, they could also have the boss start executing ranged attacks after a certain interval of not having a character in melee range. And then if you line of sight or somehow try to get a boss stuck, after a short time, it instantly resets. Easy peasy. But for a final statement, they say in situations where they don't want this to happen, they'll have other ways to prevent this without leaning into that kind of mechanic. Now the biggest question for me personally out of the entire roundtable, this question is about the healing classes of the game and the difference between them. Healing classes currently have 3 listed in the game: clerics, shamans, and druids. This player wants to know, what are the strengths and weaknesses of each class and how will their playstyles differ? The answer? At a fundamental level, Pantheon distinguishes the 3 healers through their primary healing styles. They view the clerics as the masters of barrier healing, so preventative and mitigating healing magic, druids are the masters of direct healing, and shamans are the masters of healing over time. Now that doesn't mean we're not going to see variation within these toolkits, it's just that those are considered to be their bread and butter healing styles, and so that's what the majority of their kind of healing will be designed with. And then of course there's also strength to each one of those classes that complement those specialties. For example, clerics have a knack for stronger armor and can wear plate mail. They're going to be encouraged to take a frontline presence and will have access to higher skill caps, especially with crushing weapons to play into the cleric with the hammer and shield fantasy. Druids on the other hand, because they'll have more potent single target heals, they're going to need to be cautious of overhealing. And so they're going to benefit from an expanded offensive damage kit as the pace of the battle permits. And then finally, shamans. Because they're primarily heal over time based, we need to give them time for the heal to do their job. On top of this, shamans will get access to a wide arsenal of really potent buffs and debuffs, things that can weaken the damage at the source or multiply the party's powers so they can end the fight more quickly. Moving on to the final 3 questions we'll cover today. The first is, what is the class design philosophy when it comes to the cooldown cast abilities? An example would be Shadow Knight Harm Touch or Paladin Lay On Hands from EverQuest, both of which were on a roughly 1-hour cooldown. Will Pantheon employ these types of long cooldown abilities, and if so, how does that fit into the limited action system? They first start off by saying that they don't want to make a commitment to a maximum cooldown time just yet, but just to throw it out there, the highest cooldown ability that they currently have implemented in the kits at the moment sits around 5 minutes. That being said, they personally love the idea of iconic abilities being on long cooldowns. They're talking about 30-minute cooldowns, hour-long cooldowns, skills that can be used to turn the tide of a fight or function as an emergency button. They're totally fine with all of that. But in terms of the limited action set related to this question, they understand it might seem limiting in how they would navigate something like this, especially if you only have 8 slots on your bar and you end up with something on an hour-long cooldown. You'd really feel like you're making a big sacrifice having to wait that cooldown for the whole hour. so it is something they would like to do, but this needs to be done right and will require more testing. The next question we'll want to cover in this video: will caster techniques require you to be in melee range to cast them? While casters are going to have some more melee-oriented techniques, there's going to be other ones that are casted at range or act as point-blank area of effects. To give a practical example, while the druid is perfectly capable of running up to somebody and hitting it with their staff, techniques are going to give them another opportunity to plant that staff into the ground and act as a lightning rod for temporary field damage. Or an enchanter may be able to raise their staff Gandalf style and release a burst of light from the tip of it that creates an area of effect blind that they might normally not have access to in their toolkit. And then some techniques are going to be better suited to situational use. You're probably not going to run up on a mob in melee range just to use a technique that acts as a tonal knockback, for example, but you might want to lean on that if you accidentally pull aggro, or at least buy a few extra seconds in a solo-based situation. The next question: will casters have the same melee weapon skill caps as melee classes so they can actually hit targets instead of missing over and over again? When it comes to casters, they will be falling into the lower end of weapon proficiency, but the team is very sensitive to how this feeds into things like accuracy. And while miss events and unpredictable outcomes are very important to them for creating dynamic encounters, they're carefully managing the accuracy gap between those lowest and highest skills, as well as ensuring that there's plenty of avenues, whether it's itemization, buffs, or other character development systems, to help players offset and mitigate that. The very last topic mentioned in the roundtable that I want to dive into for this video: will race affect class to a deeper level than what class is available? Like, would a shaman human versus shaman archai have different backgrounds and potentially spirit guides, like a timberwolf, arctic wolf, direwolf, or something like a polar bear? They state that this is another tough one because although they would love to see something like that happen, they can't commit to it happening at this time. But they can say that there are now deeper differences between the race than just the classes available to them. One fairly substantial change between the last pre-alpha session and now is that they now have a much greater degree of variance in their attributes. Not just the ones they start with, but also the attribute points they grow with over the span of leveling. They want these aspects of the game to have flavor and want players to experience the game in different ways, alongside also being able to offset those weaknesses. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all we have to dive into currently for the May Developer Roundtable for Pantheon. A lot of detail to jump into, but I hope you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful night or day. Farewell.